we've determined that the border should remain open because, and this is going to sound cynical, but if you go back to Joe Biden's first day in office, his second executive order was to mandate that the 2030 census count every person in the U.S., not just citizens, permanent resident aliens, but everybody who's in the country at that time, in a cynical effort to increase congressional seats and electoral vote college votes for the Democrat Party. And I hate to say it, but it sounds and it looks like American safety and security is being sacrificed for political power.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Long before the FBI was openly and notoriously meddling in elections, targeting conservative Catholics, and entrapping Trump supporters, it was bungling high-profile nonpartisan matters of law enforcement. Just ask Richard Jewell about the Atlanta Olympics bombing, or Stephen Hatfill about the post-9/11 anthrax attacks, or the girls on the U.S. gymnastics team sexually abused by Dr. Larry Nassar. But then there are the successes to consider as well. The captures of the Oklahoma City bombers, the D.C. sniper, and the Unabomber. What are we to make of Teddy Roosevelt's brainchild 116 years after its inception? It seems a government agency of any size is too big to fail, but particularly one that can cloak itself in truth, justice, and the American way, all while avoiding transparency with ongoing investigations and abstract promises of internal reforms with only whatever passes for congressional oversight to work around. The great academic Angelo Codevilla, who coined the phrase political ruling class, wrote of the FBI back in 2020, "Once upon a time, FBI foreign counterintelligence officers were cops first. Like all good cops, they knew the difference between the people on whose behalf they worked and those who threatened them." But Codevilla argued that changed in the late 1970s when William Webster came in and political correctness with him, along with the FISA Act. According to Codevilla, FBI officers became standard bureaucrats who learned to operate on the assumption that all Americans were equally likely as not to be proper targets of investigation. They replaced the distinctions by which they had previously operated with the classic bureaucratic imperative: look out for yourselves by making sure to please the powerful. So, how does the FBI balance sheet net out? More of an asset to a free country or a liability? If it's the latter, is structural reform realistic once an organization of that size and power has given over to partisan politics? To give us an even-handed view on this, we're pleased to be joined by Kevin Brock on this installment of Counterculture. He is a former assistant director of intelligence for the FBI, was an FBI special agent for 24 years, and former principal deputy director for the National Counterterrorism Center. Though he has served in all those posts, he's also been willing to be publicly critical of his former employer when he deemed it appropriate. He's an honest broker on the topic, which is why we should give what he has to say a hearing. Kevin, welcome to Counterculture. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Dan, it's great to be with you, and I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, and I really mean that too. We've had so many conversations on my show out of Chicago that, if Christopher Wray or Jim Comey would talk to the American people the way that you do about the threats and the challenges, the successes and the failures, and give some sort of honest stock of the FBI's performance in a specific instance or over a specific time period, I think there'd be a lot less skepticism about it. But we just haven't gotten that from the leadership of that agency and many others, but that agency too.
Well, thank you for saying that, because that's what I strive for. As you mentioned, I spent 24 years of my adult life in the FBI, and I love the FBI. I love the institution. I love what the FBI is. And it's actually even more than an institution. It's an idea that you can have an honest, objective, nonpartisan entity in this country that will do all of the investigations regarding those who have potentially or are breaking federal statutes. That's incredibly important to our democracy, for the democracy to actually exist. You've got to have that, and other countries are jealous of it because they don't have that. And that reputation, which the Bureau carefully cultivated over 100 plus years now, with some bumps, major bumps along the road, but in general maintained the trust of the American people, has been damaged and has suffered in the last, since 2016, when the FBI under the Comey directorship decided that it was their role to directly meddle in the campaign of a major presidential candidate without adequate legal justification to do so.
What about what Codevilla said, the portion of his essay that I just referenced, where he talked about William Webster, who came in as head of FBI late 70s into the Reagan years. He partnered with the ACLU to push the FISA Act. And, was that the beginning of the politicization of the FBI, as Codevilla argues, that it was now we're here to serve the powerful interests who will serve our interests in expanding the power of the agency, and it became this symbiotic relationship with the American public sort of cut out?
I probably have a little different view than he does on this, only because prior to 1969, 68, 69, wiretaps conducted by the FBI were done just at the discretion of the executive branch. They decided there was really no judicial process behind it. And so if the Kennedy administration decided that they wanted a wiretap on Martin Luther King Jr., then that's what the FBI did. If there was decisions that they wanted wiretaps on Vietnam War protesters, then that's what they did. So under the Omnibus Crime Act of 1968-69, I can't remember exactly what year it was, they decided to make that type of intrusive power and authority of the FBI subject to law and judicial process. And so that we have Title III now under the Title 18 provisions of the U.S. Code. And then subsequent, and that was for criminal violations, and not all federal criminal violations, just a very select few. And it was used mostly against organized crime, terrorism, and drug traffickers. Now, fast forward a few years, and we start to see the codification of using intrusive electronic surveillance against national security threats, quote unquote. What's a national security threat? Well, that's any threat emanating from a foreign power that's inimical to the interests of the United States. Again, wide range of interpretation there, and I probably what Coda was referencing was that this now the government is deciding who the enemies are and what kind of intrusive coverage they're going to be subjected to. But at least it was they created a FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Under that act, a legal act, they set up a court, they set up a judicial process that the FBI and other intelligence community agencies have to process through in order to exercise these authorities. So if anything, during that time period in the 70s, late 60s and the 70s, there was an effort to constrain under legal process those authorities. Now, have they been abused? We saw it abused by the FBI when they decided to go ahead and initiate a FISA electronic surveillance of Carter Page. And one other point I'll make quickly, Dan. FISA electronic surveillance is much more intrusive than Title III criminal wiretap and electronic surveillance. FISA doesn't have some of the minimization requirements. And if you want to get into that detail, I can, but it's a little easier to listen to all conversations under FISA. Under a FISA electronic surveillance, very intrusive. You can put cameras in people's bedrooms, bathrooms. You can listen to every conversation in the house and capture everything. Title III, not so much. So it is a tool, a very invasive tool that has to have tight constraints to ensure that we're not violating basic rights. But FISA, again, is supposed to be pointed at foreign intelligence, foreign operators who don't enjoy the same type of constitutional protections. Now, when FISA is aimed at a U.S. citizen or permanent resident alien, then even under the FISA Act, the FBI has to articulate probable cause for doing so.
Right, but the FISA courts became a rubber stamp for whatever the FBI wanted based on the number of FISA applications that were rejected by the judges, right? I mean, that's essentially what happened. So there's sort of agency capture within this structural setup. And I guess you said, well, right, you have to have people in positions of checks and balances to be those checks and balances. So then if you fast forward to 2016 forward, I mean, so how does the layman understand what happened? You mentioned the Carter Page abuse, and obviously the story of the FBI's performance 2016 to present has been well documented. But Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe and Peter Strzok and all these people were like a sleeper cell within the FBI, and they just got triggered by Trump, and all of a sudden the FBI is an agency that is unrecognizable in terms of their behavior to a veteran like yourself. I mean, how do you pinpoint the inflection where the culture started to change, or where people started coloring outside the lines? Is it a few personnel decisions, or is it something more structural? I mean, people just have a hard time. It's almost like Trump was this watershed moment, or we're to understand Trump was this watershed moment, and because he posed this threat to democracy, that it was all hands on deck and all the normal rules were suspended. But is that really how it went down, or is it something that's more subtle and layered and dates back further than we think?
Yeah, I think it's an iterative thing, and you touched on it. So good insight on your part, and that is that the FISA court largely was a rubber stamp, frankly, particularly on FISA orders against foreign nationals. There wasn't a lot of debate. The hurdle to get over legally to start an electronic surveillance of a foreign national is not a high bar. And so the court, and the vast majority of FISA orders are directed against foreigners, known or suspected terrorists, known or suspected intelligence officers from hostile nations, the vast majority. So it became a little bit of a factory, churning out these electronic surveillances. And so with that in mind, you get to 2016 and you have this manufactured Crossfire Hurricane case directed against the Trump campaign. And you have, I called it a cabal. I called it a rogue entity in my writings. It was a tight-knit group of people at FBI headquarters deciding to launch an investigation with no legal basis to do so, and against the Trump campaign. And they had this wonderful FISA court that they could pretty much get anything through. So when we talk about reform of FISA, that, I think, is where the reform is going to have to be targeted, to see how much of this became an automatic paper mill, and how much do we have to tighten up, rotate back, and make sure that each application is looked at on a standalone basis. Now, in fairness to the court, in the Carter Page situation, they were provided a false affidavit. They were provided an affidavit that had a lie in it. And if the truth had been told, hopefully the FISA court judges would have said, this doesn't make sense and we're not going to issue the order. We don't know that for sure. So there's a mix of a lax process plus an affidavit that was sworn to that was false on its face. And those who were responsible for submitting that false affidavit, and it was more than just Kevin Kleinsmith, the line attorney who signed it and who doctored it. It was those above him, from Comey, McCabe, Strzok, pushing that FISA application at all costs, and maybe just as egregious as the FISA court order itself is the fact that none of those individuals have been held accountable for this grievous act and misuse of the court.
So what do you make of the reporting that was done recently by Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, who essentially argue through their sources that the entire Russian collusion matter was actually cooked up mainly by CIA, by John Brennan, And then it was sort of like what the government did with big tech companies, outsourcing what they couldn't do to somebody who could do it. So the CIA is going to do one piece of this, and he's enlisting other agencies and other agency heads to do their bidding in this larger play, this larger, what I would call a fifth column action against the Trump campaign. But the idea, so it wasn't something that fell into CIA or FBI's lap and they sort of just blew through a bunch of red lights. That was actually cooked up from the beginning, which is a different thing entirely. But I wanted to get sort of your spidey senses on that. Does that sound plausible to you, particularly with what we know about Brennan and Clapper and Comey?
Yeah, at this point we have to almost rely on spidey senses because we don't have the evidence, we don't have the follow-up investigation that should be launched into how all of this unfolded. But there's plenty of circumstantial evidence that there was a intergovernmental collaboration to engineer an outcome that was going to be unfavorable to Trump, damage him politically, and perhaps keep him from being elected president of the United States. Now, back then, don't forget, almost nobody in America thought Donald Trump was going to beat Hillary Clinton. But there was certainly lined up in the Obama administration individuals who did not want to see him become president at any cost, and we saw evidence of that. John Brennan made his views very clear, both back then and certainly subsequently. So has James Comey and others. It's beyond doubt that these individuals were not in favor, did not like Donald Trump. So with that as a backdrop and looking at the circumstances of how all of this unfolded, where they took little threads of information, whether it was from some old informant of the FBI and CIA, whether it was barroom talk, with the Australian diplomat by George Papadopoulos, and they kind of knitted together a theory that somehow Donald Trump was colluding or collaborating or communicating with Russian intelligence. But it was so thin that relying on the FBI to carry forward an investigation along those lines, the FBI had to initiate an investigation that had no substance or basis. They opened up a Foreign Agent Registration Act case against unknown people in the Trump administration under a theory that they were collaborating with the Russians. They had not a single fact to back that up. And they certainly didn't have any facts that anybody in the Trump campaign was acting as a foreign agent.
I know the argument goes that, this is a cabal, as you say. It's at the leadership level, the executive level, essentially, and it's not representative of the rank and file. But when you're initiating an investigation that's this high profile in the context of a presidential election, and at some point it becomes publicly known and everybody's talking about it. So I'm sure internally at the water coolers, everybody was talking about it at FBI too. And nobody internally is coming to the same conclusions that skeptics outside of the agency are suggesting is what's happening. And to the extent that they did internally, nobody says anything about that. I mean, there's nobody at the FBI that says, oh my goodness, this is a case, as you just described, without a factual predicate. This is a presidential election. If and when this goes south, this is going to do enormous damage to the agency, to the republic. What is it that Comey and this cabal within my agency are doing? We need to do something about this. We need to say something.
Yes. Huge point and a difficult issue, and I'll give two perspectives here. Number one, there were agents, line agents, others inside the FBI who were greatly dismayed that this case was initiated and largely run out of headquarters. That's just not, Dan, that's just not done. And so that was strangely unfamiliar to line agents in the FBI. and there was a lot of talk about that. Now, as to the merits of the case, whether there should have been an investigation of Russian collusion, you're going to have two perspectives inside the FBI. Number one, I think if everybody realized that this was a direct investigation of U.S. persons in the Trump campaign, they would have expressed extreme concern and doubt. However, if this had been an investigation opened up against the Russians attempting to influence the Trump campaign or insinuate themselves in the election process, no problem. The FBI does that every day. That's what they're supposed to do. But that's not how they opened the case. They opened it against U.S. citizens, not against Russians, as is normally the case. So in the early days, it probably would have been a point of confusion inside the FBI as to exactly what was going on, confused that it's being run out of headquarters, not sure whether there's merits to this case, probably convinced that, yeah, the Russians probably are trying to go after the Trump campaign, just as they're probably trying to go after the Clinton campaign. So, but the other point I'll make real quick as to your observation that why isn't somebody just speaking up? There's a 100-year history and tradition inside the FBI that you don't talk about ongoing investigations. You don't talk to the press. You can get a lot of trouble if you, without authorization, talk to the press overtly. So that's why you see people trying to blanket themselves with whistleblower protection now, who are still in the FBI, to come out and complain about certain things. That's an avenue to legally protect themselves. But even then, they suffer huge consequences for doing so, and we've seen that with some whistleblowers who get suspended, lose pay at that, and that type of thing. So it's if there's something that is in need of, as far as reform goes inside the FBI right now, that there are a number of areas, but that would be one of them. How can an agent who sees wrongdoing ensure that that observation reaches to the levels that it needs to be reached, and that it gets adequate attention?
Yeah, I mean, I get that, and obviously we've seen whistleblowers come forward at the IRS, most notably in the Hunter Biden case, and FBI too, with respect to this. But I mean, in the early days, confusion, fog of war, okay. I mean, you know, by the time you're a couple years in and the Mueller testifies before Congress, and what a catastrophe that was for Mueller, and the DOJ IG issues his report on the performance of the FBI with substantial rebukes of Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and others, and still you feel like nobody's really taking this seriously, and a new regime comes in of sorts with Christopher Wray, and you get the we're properly chastened, and I'm going to institute reforms in these areas. But as I sort of said at the outset, it's sort of the honor system in terms of whether any reforms are made or not, and whether or not we should trust your review that these things are being implemented or not. And then while this is supposedly going on, of course, we have Jan 6. And we have now more than 2 years of Christopher Wray saying, I don't know if anybody was there, and if anybody was there, I don't know how many. So, I mean, you're just like pulling out your hair, saying, I know you're lying to me. You're not telling me the whole thing. I feel like even if there's legitimate reasons to not be, openly talking about ongoing cases because you don't want to jeopardize, I get it. But I feel like you're really doing that just to misdirect and lie to me and not tell me everything you know and not answer questions that should be publicly disclosed to the American citizens. You just feel like this is just one long-running, cover your butt, feed them, treat them like mushrooms, take your lumps before congressional hearings because they don't really matter, and it's business as usual.
Yeah. You just articulated the pain of half the country and the frustration. And I've written about this. I said the most valuable thing that the FBI possesses is the trust of the American people, and right now it's low. Right now the FBI, I say, is at its nadir in its 100+ year history as far as the trust of the American people. The American people want to trust the FBI. The American people love the FBI story. We still see quite a few FBI TV shows on the networks. And and that reflects the desire of the country for an FBI that they can believe in. So my position has always been the number one job of the director of the FBI is to ensure that trust exists and to do whatever it takes to make sure that the people of the United States can trust the FBI. And that I think Christopher Wray does some things very well, but if I were him, this is something I would change drastically. Too often he says, I can't comment on that because it's an ongoing investigation. That's not true. There are a lot of things you can do to explain without damaging the integrity of an ongoing investigation. You can give perspective. You can explain why you can't comment, and he doesn't even do that. So so there's a lot of leeway to be able to explain to the American people. And if you do explain it clearly and you articulate the reasons why, then people will understand it. I'll give you an example. So when it came to light, and maybe you wanted to touch on this, Dan, so if I'm segueing for you, great. But when the Republicans learned that the FBI had a source, whom we now know as Alexander Smirnov, who reported that the Bidens received $5 million payment to assist with the problems of Burisma, the CEO of Burisma, as a bribe. And so, of course, shocking allegations delivered by a source, who at the time the Bureau had graded as credible and reliable based on other information that he had provided in the past. So the Republicans start salivating over this bit of information, and they demand to see the initial reporting received by the FBI from Alexander Smirnov on what was called a Form 1023, I believe. This is raw reporting. This is the source saying, this is what I heard. There's no vetting of that information. You just write it down just as it's given to you. You don't know if it's true. You don't know if it's false. It is in its rawest form. So the FBI doesn't obviously publicize that kind of information because oftentimes the nature of dealing with confidential human sources is almost 50% of the time they're wrong. They give you false information. So you don't want to release that because some of the information is so damning, it injures reputations of people who otherwise are innocent. That's the rationale for not turning it over. So when Christopher Wray told Congress, I'm not giving it to you, and they pitch a fit and they threaten subpoenas, they threaten being held in contempt of Congress, that was the reason. But he didn't explain that. He didn't take the time to explain the rationale behind his no. And eventually he allowed them to look at it. The Republicans, they wanted to make political hay out of it. They ran with it, and now it is snapping back on them. So there was some good reason for not releasing that 1023. So my larger point is there is a lot that can be explained about why the FBI has to do certain things, and that then builds trust. When the director fails to explain it, then it leaves, rightfully so, the American people room to start doubting that, or start believing that they're hiding something, and that they're acting politically, and in some cases they've been caught acting politically.
Well, right. That would have been an opportune time to say we established a bad precedent with the Steele dossier, getting ahead of ourselves with unreliable information. So right. I don't want to do that. I don't want Republicans to do that. Let's not do that. Let's go back to the way we're supposed to vet information and verify information before we start making wild claims or claims that can't be substantiated. So, but because that trust has been broken, and because the FBI did what Republicans did previously with the Steele dossier that was cooked up by the Hillary Clinton campaign, Republicans, of course, are skeptical. You're hiding something because I don't trust you, and that's how it all breaks down, right? Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
And so one other thing before we get more into Wray and reforms and thinking about what FBI and FISA and the intelligence agency should look like. competence. So I mentioned at the outset, so, these are high-profile cases, and when the FBI makes high-profile mistakes, that people are going to remember them. And sometimes Clint Eastwood is going to turn them into a movie. So Richard Jewell, the anthrax case, Larry Nassar. I mean, I could go back to when I was a kid. I mean, Ruby Ridge, right? And others, where you say, you forget the politics of it, just the competency level. And as the FBI, I mean, is this a fair point? I don't know. As the FBI became more political, did the competency on the nonpartisan law enforcement piece of it slide? Is that a fair concern? Can we essentially track that, some of these high-profile failures? Well, this is where the FBI started taking their eye on the ball and expanding their mission and getting into palace intrigue inside the Beltway, and they forgot to run the traps before they accused somebody of bombing the Olympics or of sending anthrax-laced envelopes.
Right. So, as you mentioned, high-profile cases bring high pressure, a lot of attention, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of demand for action, and sometimes, as you pointed out in the past, the FBI got out ahead of its skis and started. In the case of Richard Jewell, in the case of the anthrax case, they accused somebody wrongly under this kind of pressure to make a call and to indict somebody. So those types of mistakes, that type of incompetence, if it rises to that level, is high visibility. Linking it to the political, I will say this. I had a long career in the FBI. I have never seen the degree of political influence on the FBI that I have seen since 2016 to present day. That's 8 years, spanning two different administrations, two different Justice Departments. And we can point to events that have occurred, particularly under this current administration, where DOJ has become more politicized than it has been in the past and has exerted pressure on the FBI to embark on certain actions and investigations that I think were ill-advised. The most glaring, there's three glaring ones that come to mind immediately. First is the search at Mar-a-Lago. Second is the search of the journalists who were in possession of Ashley Biden's diary. And third is the arrest of the pro-life father at his home early one morning in Pennsylvania. In each one of those instances, the FBI was pressured by the Department of Justice or the local U.S. Attorney's Office to embark on these ill-advised, foolhardy search or arrest warrant missions. The FBI, here's where the FBI was wrong. They didn't say no, and they could have. The FBI is quasi-independent. They are nested under DOJ, but they have every authority and right to say no to DOJ and to the president if they believe that what's being asked is not proper under the law. And in each of those situations, the decisions to do a search at Mar-a-Lago, the decision to roust journalists early one morning in search of a $20 diary belonging to the president's daughter, and the decision to do an early morning arrest in front of his family of a man who every Wednesday was praying the rosary outside a Planned Parenthood clinic. We knew where he was. They knew where he was every Wednesday afternoon, and he had offered to turn himself in. All of these are unconscionable decisions that were politically motivated, and the FBI had no business participating in them. And I'll stand on that criticism as long as I can, because I don't want this stuff to be replicated.
Let me add one more and get your reaction to it, and that is essentially running interference for Hunter Biden and an investigation into Biden family business dealings with respect to the laptop, and then obviously, as we know, DOJ in particular with respect to the IRS investigation. I mean, so that there's tackling and then there's blocking, and they've been doing both for political reasons.
Yeah, on the Hunter Biden laptop case, I have a little less line of sight on that as far as details, but I will say this. It's been a debacle since day one. The letter that was engineered and signed by 51 former, mostly CIA executives or those associated with the CIA, calling it as the laptop has all the classical earmarks of a Russian intelligence operation, was shameful. It was a shameful letter. It was purposefully engineered out of whole cloth, meaning a lie, to provide Biden with a talking point during the debates in 2020. Embarrassing for all those, and many of those who signed were personal friends of mine, people I knew from National Counterterrorism Center days, and I still consider friends, but I'm embarrassed for them. That's indicative of the desperation behind this crazy laptop that belonged to Hunter Biden and fell into the hands of the public, essentially. And so all of the embarrassing stuff on there, and much of what we know about the Biden family influence campaign with hostile foreign governments in order to enrich Hunter Biden, i.e., the rest of the Biden family, by using the status of Joe Biden as then vice president and future president of the United States. It's a fair question. It's fair for the Republicans in Congress to be investigating it. I have made this point before. I think the Smirnoff information of a $5 million bribe actually is inconsequential to that investigation. What we know in the public domain right now about what Hunter Biden did with his father to get contracts with the Chinese government, with Ukraine energy company, with Moscow mayors, and all these unsavory characters, all of that, which we know publicly, is enough to launch, I think, there's an adequate predication to launch a criminal investigation into influence peddling and money structuring and money laundering. It's there. But under this DOJ, it's not going to happen. And the FBI won't be able to, I just don't know if that investigation is going on, where it is, if it's stalled, if it's, if they've been told by justice, go ahead and investigate, but we're not going to prosecute. We don't know.
Right. And all of these law enforcement and intel officials that were doing everything that they did to save the republic because they were concerned about Trump being compromised. And it turns out that just on the face of it, as per what we know in the public domain about the Biden Inc. operation, well, he's obviously compromised, or he could be. We don't know that it's formally impacted policymaking in any way. We can't connect those dots. But I mean, just the circumstantial case, well, obviously there are people who could put pressure on him who have interests averse to America's, and he's the president of the United States, for God's sakes. And there's no interest from those same people about those appearances and those perils. And so, I mean, given the cases that you just mentioned, and layering in Biden and conceding the politicized nature of these agencies over the last 8 years, then how do we ever get back to an FBI and a FISA court that interact in a way where one is a check on the other, and that are both interested in calling balls and strikes and the equal application of the law as opposed to partisan outcomes? I mean, how do we walk ourselves back to that place we were maybe more close to 8 years ago? It doesn't seem like there's a straight line back to that place.
Yeah, great observation, and I'm going to address that, but I want to give you one counterpoint to something you said. I think there is evidence of favorable treatment of China by the Biden administration. We see it with some of their policies regarding the ability of China to acquire land and strategic places in the United States. That never should have happened, and it's been allowed to happen. We saw it almost immediately after the Biden administration came to power, where they lifted normal restrictions or FBI investigative interest in Chinese students in this country. That was kind of taken off the board. And that was a very powerful counterintelligence program that the FBI ran, and it was basically smothered.
You still have to establish, the nexus for the quid pro quo if you were going to, criminally prosecute them. But I mean, I see your point. There's areas where you say, was that a result of the conflict of interest, and was that, a 1 for 2, and it should be investigated, right? No, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, to your point, I don't know that they would be able to introduce it as evidence of a crime, but it's certainly circumstantial indicators that there were curious policies, frankly. When you look at our national security, why are they doing this? This is curious. It raises eyebrows anyway, and you wonder why they're doing it. But then when you look at the fact that the Biden family has grifted a lot of money out of PRC, then it starts to make sense to a common, reasonable person. Now, just to address your to address your ideas of reform, I think it's critically important. We can go back to the late 70s when the Attorney General guidelines under the Church Committee were, as it became a product of that Church Committee hearings, looking into reforms of the FBI in wake of the FBI's perceived abuses of investigations into anti-war protesters and civil rights protesters. So that was a legitimate and rightful effort to reform the FBI and bring them under an umbrella of guidelines that would ensure that anybody who's investigated by the FBI there are articulable facts that a reasonable person would be led to believe an investigation should be held. So we moved away from that. We saw abuses of the Attorney General guidelines in the last few years. So how do we reform? Well, this back and forth congressional committee hearing investigations that ping pong Americans back and forth depending on who controls that House of Congress at any 4 or 2 year period is getting tiresome. So I think that there should be an effort, if there's a sincere desire in this country for this type of reform, then let's have a true bipartisan committee of luminaries. Can be legislators, can be former members of an executive branch, can be former members of the court system. Anyway, bipartisan, down the middle, no advantage to either party, as nearly as we can construct that, and we start looking at these issues again, and examining the abuses that took place, and looking for remedies to make sure that they don't happen before. The Attorney General guidelines were an excellent remedy back in the 70s. They need to be retightened, and I think something along those lines is called for now.
So I was at a luncheon the other day, and this guy who lives in North Carolina now, he said, if Mark Robinson, who won the primary for the Republican nomination for governor of North Carolina, if Mark Robinson wins, then we get control back of North Carolina. He's a Republican, obviously. He said, I got a question for you, talking to me. He's like, if we wanted to kick FBI field offices out of North Carolina, say we prohibit the FBI from having a field office in North Carolina, could we do that? And I mean, and this is like, a successful business guy in his early 60s. This isn't some, sort of young conservative Turk who was at CPAC. This is where, like, otherwise serious, sober, law-abiding Americans are with respect to the FBI. I had never even contemplated that question, of course, and I certainly never expected to be asked it. But I mean, what would you say to that guy saying, "Hey, if we get control, I don't even want an FBI field office in my state"?
I'd say I understand your sentiment, but there's no chance that's going to happen. First of all, the FBI is a federal law enforcement entity. It's set up to investigate violations of federal law and protect national security. It's not there for the enforcement of state laws, although it cooperates with state officials. It is also there to investigate corruption at the state level, and so wishing it away is just not going to happen. But what I would want to do if I were director of the FBI is sit down with him and understand the frustrations. Where are they coming from? What can we do to make sure to win back that trust? And but on a practical level,
I know practically. Yeah, practically, of course. But so thinking about the reforms, though, you just mentioned FBI to investigate and enforce federal law and provide for national security, its role in that. Does a reform of the FBI, should that include, and I know maybe this is teeing this up for you since you were a counter-intel guy, does that include reducing its mission to federal law enforcement? Would that be better, that the FBI just focus on kidnappers and interstate criminals and criminal organizations and public corruption and got out of the business of national security?
This has been a question that has been teed up since 9/11, and it almost happened. 9/11 Commission was ready to recommend that. Congress was mobilizing to recommend two different agencies in this country, one to address national security and the threats, and one to just focus on criminal acts. There is an enticing wisdom behind that, but there's, I think, a greater argument and wisdom to have it co-located. And in fact, while that was a popular discussion back in the early 2000s, and I was still in the FBI, I was at the assistant director level, so C-suite level, we were getting feedback from both England and Canada where that is the case, where you have two different entities fulfilling those roles, saying, don't do it. Don't break up the FBI. You have a huge advantage of having your law enforcement mission co-located with your national security mission for intelligence sharing, for cross-pollination of intelligence, because oftentimes they bleed into each other. Those terrorist organizations are committing criminal acts and criminal conspiracies to fund themselves. From a counterintelligence standpoint, there's some efficiencies gained. Now, I did argue when I had moved on to become deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center. I made a proposal to Mueller, who, by the way, as director, was the one who successfully got the 9/11 Commission and Congress to back off of that proposal by promising, first and foremost, that he would create an intelligence division inside the FBI, which he did, and I was the first assistant director. After I moved on from that and went to the National Counterterrorism Center, and looking at some of the difficulties and perceptions that you just articulated, I proposed that we create greater separation, but within the FBI, that we have two field offices, one for criminal, one for national security. Whether they're co-located or two separate buildings, I don't know. I didn't want to inflict more cost on the taxpayer, but under the theory that agents should start to specialize in one or the other, and that each entity has its own budget and its own tools, and Mueller, he listened to it, but it wasn't an idea that caught hold. But I saw it as maybe a bit of a compromise on both positions. So. Just an example of an issue where it feels like the FBI is AWOL, the national security side, which is, there's multiple reasons why I think this debate has been reignited. It's what the FBI has done and what it's not doing. Now, Christopher Wray has been before these congressional committees, and he's talking about, open borders, letting some bad, to borrow from Trump, letting some bad hombres in. We know there are people on the terror watch list that are getting in. We know there are people that are part of criminal syndicates, cartels, and the like that are getting in. That's kind of a problem. But this would seem to me an opportunity to potentially regain some of the trust that's been lost by taking a more public position on border security. There was just a Colombian on the terror watch list that was picked up a couple days before both Biden and Trump were in Texas. Obviously you've got high profile
violent crimes against American citizens by people in this country illegally. You had a state trooper in Washington State who was just killed by a Mexican national who's been committing crimes in this country for 11 years. And, you know, people see this and they're, of course, flabbergasted and exasperated. And boy, here comes Joe Friday to say, we made some mistakes and we've disappointed you, but let me tell you, what you're saying about what's happening at the border and how every state has become a border state, that's a real thing, and here's what the FBI is going to do about it.
You're going to cause me to pull out one of my soapboxes, so I will do that. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
And Dan, I and 9 other former FBI high-level executives, assistant director level executives, signed a letter to Congress in January expressing our concerns about this very topic, and we didn't want to have comparisons drawn between our letter and the goofy letter signed by the 51 former CIA executives. That was purely political. Ours was motivated out of concern about the open border and the fact that we're specifically having set aside the poor families looking for relief from poverty. Everybody has compassion for that, although they shouldn't be breaking the law. We're concerned about the single military-aged males flooding into this country from countries who are state sponsors of terrorism, China and Russia, countries hostile to the United States. And here they come, tens of thousands that we know of. The FBI director sat next to Secretary Mayorkas in a hearing a couple months ago, I think it was in December, where they were asked point blank, what are the big threats in this country? And the FBI director had an opportunity to address that very threat, and instead articulated some concerns about white supremacists and homegrown terrorists inside the country, because he had Mayorkas sitting right next to him, and it may have been a little bit of professional courtesy not to slam the open border in front of him and put him on the spot. But I was frustrated hearing that, because it was ignoring the gaping threat at the border, the elephant in the room. And now since then, he has talked about that threat. But here's what I would love to hear from an FBI director at this point. Right now, the FBI is going to mobilize a task force, a sizable task force of FBI agents, to go down to the border and interview every swinging single military-age male that comes across this border from hostile regions, particularly China. And we're going to question them. And I guarantee you, because the FBI knows how to do this, they're really good at this, they will determine within 24 to 48 hours whether any of those individuals were tasked by their home countries or their terror organization to do anything operational in this country. They'll determine that. They'll know that. Why the FBI is not doing that right now, or if they are, they should reassure Americans that they are doing it. Why they're not doing it, I don't know. Congress, in its oversight role, should demand to know why the FBI is not doing something like that. That's on the national security side. Conversely, I think the statistics are all over the map on this, but if you listen to Mark Morgan, a former head of the CBP, he asserts that over the last 3 years there have been 90,000 encounters of individuals with criminal records from other countries attempting entry into this country. Where it gets murky is what's happened to those people. Were they turned away? Were they given a date to appear in court and released into the country? We don't know. What we do know is that violent crime has spiked in this country, committed by people who aren't supposed to be here. And we're seeing murders of young women. We're seeing sexual abuse of young children. We're seeing violent crimes committed in this country. We're seeing people killed by drunk drivers. We're seeing people who are now dead in this country who would otherwise be alive if the border wasn't open and if these types of controls were in place. We're seeing people walking around in this country today who are going to be dead in the next year or two if the policy doesn't change. But we've determined that the border should remain open because, and this is going to sound cynical, but if you go back to Joe Biden's first day in office, his second executive order was to mandate that the 2030 census count every person in the U.S., not just citizens, permanent resident aliens, but everybody who's in the country at that time, in a cynical effort to increase congressional seats and electoral vote college votes for the Democrat Party. And I hate to say it, but it sounds and it looks like American safety and security is being sacrificed for political power. And I'm not sure there's another way to frame it at this point.
No, I think that's a pretty good frame. He is Kevin Brock, former Assistant Director of Counterintel for the FBI. Kevin, thank you as always. You lived up to the advanced billing, a fair hearing, and some great thoughts on all of these topics with respect to both domestic law enforcement and national security. Really appreciate your time as always. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. I really appreciate it. Good talking.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.